They weren't my parents. There's a difference.
Mr. Stobner, for your crimes, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison.
The Stobner residence should have been peaceful. 9 years as a package delivery driver in this Baltimore suburb taught you your regulars, the friendly couple, their teenage foster son, the usual online orders. But May 8th, 2023 felt wrong. The reddish-brown smudge on the living room window caught the sunlight like a warning. The front door stood ajar. Through the glass, overturned furniture told the story of a violent struggle. Travis's stomach tightened. This was no place for a routine delivery. Travis set the package down and cautiously approached the window, cupping his hands around his eyes to block the glare, and what he saw made him immediately reach for his phone to dial 911. "I need police at 1847 Willow Creek Drive," he told the dispatcher, his voice shaking as he described seeing large amounts of blood splattered across the living room and what appeared to be a person's leg visible from behind the kitchen island. The dispatcher instructed Travis to remain outside the home, assuring him that officers would arrive within minutes, and asked if he had seen anyone else on the property or leaving the area. "No, ma'am," Travis responded, backing away from the house and returning to his delivery vehicle, where he would wait for the authorities while keeping watch on the residents, noting that the family's silver Audi was in the driveway, but there was no sign of the black SUV he had sometimes seen there. If you're watching this video, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from today. Now, back to the case. Baltimore police officers Melissa Chen and Devin Taylor arrived at the scene at 2:43 p.m., approaching the house with weapons drawn after receiving the dispatch about a possible homicide. Officer Chen would later testify that upon entering the residence, they were immediately struck by the overwhelming metallic smell of blood and signs of an extremely violent struggle that extended from the kitchen through the living room. The officers cleared the first floor, discovering the body of Christina Stobner, 42, lying face up on the kitchen floor with multiple stab wounds to her chest and abdomen and a large kitchen knife still protruding from her sternum. Following a trail of blood smears that appeared to show someone had been dragged or had crawled from the kitchen to the living room, they found the second victim, Christian Stobner Sr., 45, near the base of the stairs, his skull visibly crushed, and a blood-covered cast-iron skillet lying nearby. Detective James Phillips arrived at the scene at 3:17 p.m., immediately noting that the residence showed no signs of forced entry and that valuables, including electronics, jewelry, and cash in Christian Sr.'s wallet, remained untouched. The detective's first assessment, documented in his initial report, was that this appeared to be a crime of passion rather than a burglary gone wrong, and he immediately ordered officers to determine the whereabouts of all family members. A framed family photo on the mantel showed the Stobners with their teenage foster son, and neighbors quickly confirmed to officers canvassing the area that the couple had been fostering 15-year-old Christian Stobner for approximately 2 years. Detective Phillips issued an immediate bolo, "Be on the lookout," for the teenager, who was notably absent from the crime scene, and ordered officers to check local bus stations, train terminals, and to put a watch on the nearby BWI airport. The medical examiner, Dr. Eleanor Patel, conducted her preliminary examination of the bodies at the scene, estimating that the Stobners had been dead for approximately 18-24 hours, placing the time of death between the evening of May 7th and early morning of May 8th. The female victim appears to have been attacked first, with multiple stab wounds inflicted from the front, suggesting she was facing her attacker during the initial assault, Dr. Patel noted in her report, adding that the wounds were consistent with a kitchen knife, similar to the one found in the victim's chest. The male victim, she observed, had defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, indicating he had tried to fight off his attacker before suffering blunt force trauma to the skull that appeared to be the cause of death. The level of violence exhibited in these murders suggests extreme rage, Dr. Patel would later testify, particularly in the case of Mr. Stubner, whose skull was struck with such force that fragments of bone were embedded in the brain tissue. As crime scene technicians processed the residence, they discovered bloody footprints leading to the back door, and security camera footage from a neighbor's house showed a teenage male matching Christian's description leaving the Stobner home at approximately 10:30 p.m. on May 7th, carrying a backpack and heading in the direction of the main road. Detective Phillips established a timeline that suggested the murders had occurred shortly before this departure, possibly following an argument, as neighbors reported hearing raised voices coming from the Stobner house earlier that evening. The bloody footprints matched a pair of size 11 Nike sneakers that neighbors confirmed Christian typically wore, and blood spatter analysis would later confirm that the killer had been standing directly in front of Christina when she was stabbed and above Christian Sr. when he was struck with the skillet. The absence of Christian from the scene, combined with the evidence of his departure shortly after the estimated time of death, quickly made him the primary suspect in his foster parents' murders. Detective Phillips ordered a forensic examination of the teen's bedroom, where investigators discovered a disturbing piece of evidence. A torn-out magazine page featuring a glossy BMW advertisement taped to the wall with the price circled in red marker. A search of Christian's laptop found in his bedroom revealed multiple web searches for BMW, M4 price, how to get emancipated from foster parents, and, most disturbingly, how hard to hit someone to kill them. The browsing history showed these searches had been conducted in the days leading up to the murders. By that evening, police had issued an all-points bulletin for Christian Stobner, describing him as armed and dangerous, with his photos circulating on local news stations across Maryland. Social media posts from Christian's accounts, which detectives accessed through an emergency data request, showed a teenager who presented a carefully curated image of gratitude toward his foster parents in public posts. But private messages to friends revealed a different attitude. "They act like they're doing me some big favor," read one message sent to a classmate 3 weeks before the murders. "They have money, but when I ask for anything important, they always say no." Another message, sent just 2 days before the killings, was even more chilling. "I'm sick of living by their rules. They're not even my real parents." As the first day of the investigation concluded, Detective Phillips held a press conference outside the Stobner residence, now surrounded by police tape and news vans that had descended on the once quiet street. "We are currently searching for 15-year-old Christian Stobner in connection with this crime," Phillips stated, as neighbors gathered behind the police barricade, many openly weeping at the loss of the couple described by the community as exceptionally generous and patient. A woman who identified herself as Christina's colleague at the hospital where she worked as a nurse told reporters that the Stobners had opened their home to foster children for years, and that Christina had often spoken of how Christian, despite some initial adjustment difficulties, had become like a son to them. The detective's final words at the press conference were a direct appeal. "Christian, if you're watching this, turn yourself in. This situation will only get worse the longer you run." The manhunt for Christian Stobner intensified as dawn broke over Baltimore on May 9th, with law enforcement agencies across Maryland joining the search for the teenage murder suspect. Digital forensic specialists working through the night had uncovered more troubling evidence from Christian's online activities, including searches for bus schedules to various cities along the East Coast and, most concerningly, inquiries about how to obtain a fake ID. Detective Phillips coordinated with transit police to monitor all bus terminals, train stations, and airport security, providing them with Christian's photograph and description: a white male, 5'10", approximately 160 pounds, with light brown hair and a small scar above his right eyebrow. The detective also authorized the use of the city's facial recognition system to scan security camera footage from public transportation hubs, a controversial move that would later be scrutinized but ultimately deemed justified given the violent nature of the crimes. Inside the Stobner home, the forensic investigation continued with meticulous attention to detail, as crime scene technicians in white protective suits documented every blood spatter, fingerprint, and sign of struggle. The kitchen, where Christina Stobner had been killed, showed evidence of a sudden, frenzied attack, with blood spray patterns indicating she had been stabbed while standing near the island, likely facing her attacker, during what appeared to be a heated argument. A half-prepared dinner remained on the counter, chicken breasts marinating in a bowl, vegetables partially chopped on a cutting board, suggesting the attack had occurred during everyday evening activities. The living room told the story of Christian Sr.'s final moments. Blood smears on the carpet indicated he had crawled from the base of the stairs toward the front door, possibly attempting to escape or reach his phone, which was found several feet from his body with a 911 call that had been dialed but never connected. Dr. Eleanor Patel's full autopsy reports, completed by midday, confirmed her initial assessments while adding disturbing details about the brutality of the attacks. Christina Stobner had suffered 7 stab wounds to her torso, with the fatal wound penetrating her heart, causing rapid blood loss that would have resulted in death within minutes. Christian Sr.'s autopsy revealed that he had first been stabbed twice in the back, likely as he entered the kitchen and discovered the attack on his wife, before being struck repeatedly with the cast-iron skillet. The medical examiner counted at least 6 distinct blows to his head and face, far more than would have been necessary to incapacitate him. The overkill nature of the assault, particularly on Mr. Stobner, suggests the perpetrator was in a state of extreme rage or wanted to ensure the victim could not survive to identify them, Dr. Patel noted in her report. The continued assault after the victim was clearly incapacitated indicates this was not simply about neutralizing a threat, but reflected a deeper emotional component to the violence. While forensic teams processed the physical evidence, detectives began interviewing the Stobners' neighbors, friends, and colleagues, building a picture of the family dynamics that might have led to such a violent outcome. Patricia Winters, who lived next door to the Stobners for over a decade, told detectives that while the family generally seemed happy, she had noticed increasing tension in recent months. Christina mentioned at our book club last month that Christian was becoming obsessed with material things, designer clothes, expensive electronics, and that they were trying to teach him the value of money, she recalled during her interview. She said he'd become fixated on a car one of his classmates drove to school, some fancy sports car, and kept insisting they could afford to get him one for his upcoming birthday. Another neighbor, Michael Hayashi, reported hearing an argument from the Stobner house approximately 1 week before the murders, with a young male voice, presumably Christian's, shouting something about deserving better and everyone else has one. The investigation took a significant turn when detectives accessed the Stobners' financial records and discovered a series of unauthorized withdrawals from their checking account, totaling $3,000 over the 6 weeks leading up to the murders. Security footage from an ATM 5 blocks from the Stobners' home showed Christian using what appeared to be his foster father's debit card to withdraw cash on multiple occasions, always after school hours when the Stobners would have been at work. Detective Phillips theorized that Christian had been secretly accumulating money toward a down payment on the car he coveted, explaining in his case notes, "Subject appears to have been planning this purchase independently of foster parents' knowledge, suggesting premeditation and deception extending back several weeks before the homicides." By late afternoon, the forensic team made another crucial discovery. A bloody fingerprint on the handle of the cast-iron skillet matched Christian's right index finger and DNA testing of blood samples from the scene confirmed the presence of Christian's blood mixed with that of his foster father. This indicated that Christian had likely injured himself during the attack, possibly when the knife slipped or during the struggle with his foster father. This physical evidence provided the final confirmation that police needed. Christian Stobner was not just missing, he was their killer. Detective Phillips upgraded the BOLO to a formal arrest warrant, charging Christian with 2 counts of first-degree murder. As evening fell, investigators gained access to Christian's school records and began interviewing his teachers and classmates at Baltimore Heights High School, where he was a sophomore with average grades but a history of disciplinary issues. His English teacher, Ms. Rebecca Donovan, described him as intelligent but easily frustrated, and noted that he had recently written a disturbing creative writing assignment about a character who takes revenge on the people controlling his life. Several classmates described Christian as obsessed with status and constantly comparing himself to wealthier students. "He was always talking about this BMW that Trent Marshall drives to school," said Jason Cooper, identified as one of Christian's closer friends. "He kept saying his foster parents were cheap and could totally afford to buy him one just like it. But they were holding out on him because they didn't really care about him like real parents would." The most revealing interview came from Emma Schultz, a classmate who had exchanged text messages with Christian on the evening of May 7th, just hours before the estimated time of the murders. Emma provided detectives with screenshots of their conversation in which Christian complained about an argument with his foster mother over his curfew. "She's being such a bitch about me coming home late last weekend," one message read, time-stamped at 6:14 p.m. "Says I'm grounded until further notice and can forget about getting a car for my birthday." The final message, sent at 8:23 p.m., simply stated, "I'm done letting them control my life. Watch the news tomorrow." Emma told detectives she hadn't thought much about the message at the time, assuming it was typical teenage dramatics. But when she heard about the murders the next day, she had been too frightened to come forward immediately. While the interview with Emma was still in progress, Detective Phillips received the call he had been waiting for. Transit police at the Greyhound bus terminal in downtown Baltimore had detained a teenager matching Christian's description as he attempted to purchase a ticket to Charlotte, North Carolina. The arresting officers reported that the suspect had initially provided a false name, James Williams, and was carrying a backpack containing blood-stained clothing, approximately $2,200 in cash, and a prepaid debit card. Detective Phillips immediately dispatched officers to transport the suspect to Baltimore Police Headquarters, where he would personally conduct the initial interrogation. Apprehended suspect at 20:37 hours, Phillips noted in his case log. Subject attempted to flee but was detained without incident. Initial observation. Suspect appears calm and shows no visible emotional distress about the deaths of his foster parents or his current situation. News of Christian's arrest spread quickly through the media, with local stations breaking into regular programming to report that the teenage suspect in the brutal Stobner murders had been captured less than 48 hours after the discovery of the bodies. Outside the Stobner residence, where a makeshift memorial of flowers, candles, and photographs had begun to form, neighbors expressed relief that Christian was in custody but struggled to reconcile the image of the polite teenager they thought they knew with the brutal double homicide he was now accused of committing. "I used to see him helping Christina carry in groceries," said elderly neighbor Dorothy Klein, wiping away tears. "How does a child turn on people who opened their home to him like that?" As the second day of the investigation concluded, Detective Phillips prepared for what would be one of the most challenging interrogations of his 20-year career, confronting a 15-year-old suspect with evidence of a crime so brutal that it would likely see him tried as an adult despite his age. The interrogation room at Baltimore Police Headquarters was deliberately stark. White walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, 3 uncomfortable chairs, and a large mirror concealing an observation area where additional detectives and the prosecutor would watch the proceedings. Detective James Phillips entered the room at precisely 9:15 p.m. on May 9, 2023, carrying a thin manila folder and a cup of coffee, his expression professionally neutral as he faced the teenager who had been detained at the bus station just hours earlier. Christian Stobner sat with his arms crossed, his light brown hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than his 15 years, but his eyes, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of fear or remorse, told a different story. "I'm Detective Phillips," the officer began, setting down his coffee, but not opening the folder. "I understand you were trying to buy a bus ticket to Charlotte when officers found you." Christian shrugged, uncrossing his arms and leaning back in his chair with a casualness that struck the detective as incongruous with the gravity of the situation. "I was going to visit a friend," he replied, his voice steady and without the tremor that Phillips had often observed in guilty suspects during their first interrogation. "Is that against the law?" The detective noted that Christian had been read his Miranda rights upon arrest and had waived his right to have an attorney present, a decision that legal experts would later debate extensively given his age, but which the courts would ultimately uphold given the sophistication of the crimes and Christian's demonstrated understanding of the legal system through his internet searches prior to the murders. "Let's talk about what happened at your home on Willow Creek Drive," Phillips said, opening the folder to reveal crime scene photographs of the Stobner residence, though keeping the most graphic images of the victims concealed for the moment. "You were living with Christian and Christina Stobner, correct?" Christian's expression flickered briefly at the mention of his foster parents, not with sadness or regret, but with something that the detective would later describe in his report as irritation, as if the mere mention of the victims was an annoyance to him. The teenager looked at the photographs of the house exterior and living room without any visible emotional reaction, and corrected the detective. "They were my foster parents, not my real parents. There's a difference." Detective Phillips nodded, making a note of this distinction that seemed important to Christian, a detail that would later become central to the prosecution's case about the teenager's state of mind. "When was the last time you saw them?" he asked, watching Christian's body language carefully as the teen shifted slightly in his chair, the first sign of physical discomfort he had displayed. "Sunday afternoon, I guess," Christian answered, the casual insertion of "I guess" registering to Phillips as an attempt to appear vague about details the teen likely remembered with perfect clarity. "We had lunch, and then I went out with some friends. When I came back, they weren't there, so I assumed they went out somewhere." The detective slid another photograph across the table, this one showing the kitchen, with clear evidence of the violence that had occurred there, though still not revealing Christina Stobner's body. "Their cars were both in the driveway," Phillips noted calmly, "and neighbors saw you leaving the house around 10:30 p.m. on Sunday with a backpack, the same backpack officers found you with at the bus station, which contained blood-stained clothing." Christian's eyes darted to the two-way mirror briefly, perhaps realizing for the first time how much evidence the police had already accumulated before returning to meet the detective's gaze with renewed defiance. "I want a lawyer," he stated flatly, pushing back from the table. Detective Phillips closed the folder and nodded, respecting the suspect's invocation of his rights, a procedural integrity that prosecutors would later point to as evidence of the investigation's thoroughness and care. "That's your right," he responded, standing up to leave. "We'll arrange for you to speak with a public defender before we continue this conversation." As he gathered his materials to exit the interrogation room, Phillips added one final comment. "Just so you know, Christian, we found your fingerprints on the cast-iron skillet that was used to kill your foster father, and your DNA was mixed with the blood at the scene." The teenager's composure cracked momentarily, his eyes widening and his hands gripping the edge of the table before he quickly regained control and shrugged once more. "Whatever you think happened, you're wrong," he said. But the detective noted that Christian didn't ask what had happened to his foster parents or express any concern for their welfare, a telling omission that experienced investigators recognize as common among perpetrators who already know the outcome of their actions. The interview concluded at 9:27 p.m., having lasted less than 15 minutes before Christian requested legal representation, but those brief minutes provided investigators with crucial insights into the teenager's character and state of mind. While Christian waited for his appointed attorney, forensic teams continued processing evidence from both the crime scene and the items recovered from his backpack. The blood-stained clothing, a gray hoodie and jeans, tested positive for the blood of both victims, with spatter patterns consistent with someone standing in close proximity during the stabbings and subsequent bludgeoning. The cash found in Christian's possession totaled $2,247, an amount that investigators believed represented both the money he had systematically stolen from his foster parents' account and additional cash taken from Christian Sr.'s wallet after the murders. The prepaid debit card, purchased 3 days before the killings according to the activation timestamp, suggested premeditation, an exit strategy prepared in advance of the crime. Public Defender Miranda Chen arrived at police headquarters at 11:15 p.m., spending 40 minutes in private consultation with Christian before informing detectives that her client would not be making any further statements at that time. "My client is a minor who has been through a traumatic experience," Chen told the assembled investigators, choosing her words carefully in what was clearly the opening move in what would become a complex legal defense. "He is exhausted and frightened, and any questioning conducted in this state would be inherently coercive." Detective Phillips agreed to postpone further interrogation, but informed the attorney that, given the severity of the crimes and the evidence already in hand, he would be charging Christian with 2 counts of first-degree murder and seeking to have him tried as an adult. The formal charging documents were filed with the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office at 8:30 a.m. on May 10th, and by 9:15 a.m., Christian Stobner was standing before Judge Elaine Montgomery for his initial appearance in Baltimore City District Court. The teenager appeared small and vulnerable in his orange juvenile detention uniform, his hands and feet shackled according to protocol for murder suspects, regardless of age. Judge Montgomery read the charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of theft over $1,000, and 1 count of attempted flight to avoid prosecution, and asked if the defendant understood the charges against him. "Yes, Your Honor," Christian responded clearly, his voice betraying no emotion. Prosecutor Sarah Martinez, a veteran homicide prosecutor with the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, addressed the court with a forceful argument for holding Christian without bail. "Your Honor, the defendant committed these murders with extraordinary brutality, killing the very people who had opened their home to him," Martinez stated. He then methodically gathered his belongings, stole money from his victims, and attempted to flee the state. He presents both a flight risk and a danger to the community, and the state strongly urges the court to hold him without bail pending trial. Public Defender Miranda Chen countered with an argument focusing on Christian's age and lack of prior criminal record. "Your Honor, my client is 15 years old," she emphasized. "He has no history of violent behavior, and until these allegations, he was a student in good standing at Baltimore Heights High School. The Constitution requires that bail not be excessive, and we ask that the court set a reasonable bail that acknowledges both the seriousness of the charges and my client's young age and community ties." Judge Montgomery, after considering both arguments, ruled in favor of the prosecution. Given the extreme violence alleged and the evidence of flight, the defendant will be held without bail pending further proceedings. As Christian was led from the courtroom, Reporters noted that he showed no visible reaction to the judge's decision, maintaining the same emotionless demeanor he had displayed since his arrest. Outside the courthouse, Detective Phillips gave a brief statement to the assembled media, careful not to provide details that might compromise the ongoing investigation, but confirming that police believed they had strong evidence linking Christian to the murders of his foster parents. "This is a tragedy on multiple levels," Phillips told reporters, the dark circles under his eyes revealing the toll the case was already taking on him. Two people who devoted themselves to helping children in need lost their lives in a horrific act of violence allegedly perpetrated by a young man they had welcomed into their home as a son. The case quickly gained national attention, with major news outlets picking up the story of the foster teen accused of murdering his caregivers over what early reports described as a dispute about material possessions. While some media coverage focused on the sensational aspects of the case, the brutality of the killings, the apparent callousness of the suspect, others began exploring deeper questions about the foster care system, attachment disorders in adopted children, and the challenges faced by families taking in teenagers with troubled backgrounds. These broader societal questions would eventually form part of the defense strategy, but in these early days after the arrest, the focus remained firmly on the physical evidence tying Christian to the crimes. By the evening of May 10th, the prosecution team led by Sarah Martinez had filed a motion to transfer Christian's case from juvenile court to adult criminal court, citing the premeditated nature of the killings, the extreme violence employed, and the sophisticated attempts to evade capture afterward. While the defendant is chronologically 15 years old, the motion stated, his actions demonstrate a level of criminal sophistication and disregard for human life that necessitates prosecution as an adult. The motion included details from Christian's internet search history, highlighting queries about emancipation from foster parents, methods of killing, and bus routes out of state, all evidence, the prosecution argued, of careful planning rather than impulsive teenage behavior. Defense attorney Miranda Chen quickly filed an opposition to the transfer motion, arguing that Christian's case belonged in juvenile court where rehabilitation, not just punishment, would be the focus. The juvenile justice system was created precisely for cases like this one, Chen wrote, where a minor, regardless of the allegations against them, deserves the chance for intervention and rehabilitation that the adult system cannot provide. She included in her filing reports from child psychologists about the impact of multiple foster placements on adolescent development and attachment, laying the groundwork for what would become a central element of the defense, that Christian's alleged actions, however horrific, needed to be understood in the context of a childhood marked by instability and disrupted attachments. As the third day of the investigation concluded, both the prosecution and defense teams began the process of building their respective cases for what was already being described in legal circles as one of the most challenging and high-profile juvenile murder cases in Baltimore's recent history. The evidence against Christian appeared overwhelming, but the question of why a teenager would commit such a violent act against people who by all accounts had treated him well remained at the center of both the legal proceedings and the public's fascination with the case. Sometimes the why is as important as the what in cases like these, Detective Phillips told his team during their evening briefing. We've established what happened and who did it. Now we need to make sure we understand why it happened, because that's what the jury will want to know. The Baltimore County Juvenile Justice Center's largest courtroom was filled to capacity on the morning of May 24, 2023, for the transfer hearing that would determine whether 15-year-old Christian Stobner would be tried as an adult for the murders of his foster parents. Judge Raymond Wilson, a veteran of the juvenile court with over 20 years on the bench, presided over the proceedings with a grave expression that reflected the weight of the decision before him. The courtroom was divided. On one side sat relatives and friends of the Stobners, many wearing memorial pins with the couple's photograph. On the other sat a small contingent supporting Christian, primarily staff from his previous group home, and a former elementary school teacher who had maintained contact with him over the years. Prosecutor Sarah Martinez approached the podium when called by the judge, her tailored navy suit and precise movements projecting an air of unwavering confidence in the state's position. Your Honor, Maryland law provides specific criteria for determining when a juvenile case should be transferred to adult court, and this case meets every one of those criteria, Martinez began, her voice clear and authoritative. The defendant was 15 years old at the time of the offense, well above the minimum age for transfer. The crimes charged, 2 counts of first-degree murder, are among the most serious in our criminal code. The nature of these offenses was particularly heinous, involving multiple stab wounds to one victim and repeated blunt force trauma to another. Martinez methodically presented the evidence of premeditation, including Christian's internet searches, the systematic theft of money from his foster parents, and his immediate flight after the murders. Perhaps most significantly for the court's consideration of this transfer motion, Your Honor, is the defendant's level of maturity and the minimal potential for rehabilitation within the juvenile system, she continued, introducing a psychiatric evaluation conducted by the state's expert, Dr. Harold Freeman. Dr. Freeman's assessment indicates that the defendant exhibits traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, including a profound lack of empathy, manipulation, and an absence of remorse. The prosecutor emphasized that Christian would age out of the juvenile system in less than 6 years, arguing that this was insufficient time to address the profound psychological issues underlying his actions. Defense attorney Miranda Chen approached the podium next, her strategy focusing on humanizing Christian and contextualizing his actions within his troubled childhood. Your Honor, before the court makes a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of this young man's life, I ask that you consider the whole child, not just the worst act he is alleged to have committed, Chen began, her tone more measured and empathetic than Martinez's prosecutorial force. Christian Stobner entered the foster care system at age 6 after his biological mother's incarceration for drug offenses. By the time he was placed with the Stobners at 13, he had lived in 7 different foster homes and 2 group facilities. Chen introduced testimony from Dr. Melissa Rivera, a child psychologist specializing in trauma and attachment disorders in foster youth. Dr. Rivera's evaluation reveals that Christian suffers from reactive attachment disorder as a result of early childhood neglect and the instability of multiple placements, Chen explained, directing the court's attention to the expert's report. This condition profoundly affects his ability to form healthy emotional bonds and appropriate responses to conflict. When Christian perceives rejection from caregivers, such as the Stobners' refusal to purchase the car he desired, he experiences it not as a reasonable parental boundary, but as a profound abandonment that triggers extreme emotional distress. The defense strategy was clear, not to deny Christian's actions, but to frame them as the result of mental health issues stemming from childhood trauma, best addressed within the juvenile system's rehabilitative framework rather than the punitive adult system. Chen emphasized research showing adolescent brains are still developing, particularly in areas related to impulse control and consequence evaluation, arguing that Christian's actions, however horrific, reflected this neurological reality rather than irredeemable criminal intent. The juvenile justice system was created precisely for cases like Christian's, Chen concluded, where intervention, treatment, and rehabilitation offer the best hope not only for the defendant, but for society's interest in preventing future tragedy. Judge Wilson called a brief recess after the initial arguments, returning to the bench 45 minutes later with his decision. The court has carefully considered the factors outlined in Maryland Code, Courts and Judicial Proceedings article, Section 3-8A06, regarding waiver of juvenile jurisdiction, he began, his voice solemn. While I acknowledge the defense's compelling arguments regarding the defendant's troubled background and potential for rehabilitation, I cannot ignore the severity of these crimes, the evidence of premeditation, and the sophisticated attempts to evade capture afterward. The judge continued, explaining that the brutality of the murders, particularly the excessive force used against Christian Sr., and the defendant's apparent lack of remorse weighed heavily in his decision. Therefore, this court grants the state's motion to transfer jurisdiction to the Circuit Court for Baltimore County, where the defendant will be tried as an adult. A muffled sob came from the small group of Christian's supporters, while the larger contingent of Stobner family and friends remained stoically silent. Christian himself showed no visible reaction to the ruling that would potentially subject him to a life sentence rather than release at age 21. Following the transfer decision, Christian appeared for his arraignment in Baltimore County Circuit Court on June 7, 2023, before Judge Eleanor Harrington. The formal reading of the charges, 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of theft over $1,000, and 1 count of flight to avoid prosecution, echoed through the high-ceilinged courtroom as Christian stood beside his attorney, his slight frame dwarfed by the mahogany furnishings and the gravity of the proceedings. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Harrington asked, looking directly at Christian rather than his attorney. "Not guilty," Christian responded clearly, following the advice of his defense team despite what sources close to the case would later reveal was his private acknowledgement of having committed the killings. Defense attorney Miranda Chen had explained to him that a not guilty plea was necessary to ensure a full trial where his mental state and background could be presented to the jury rather than proceeding directly to sentencing. Judge Harrington set a trial date for September 18, 2023, allowing both sides ample time to prepare their cases, conduct additional investigations, and engage in pretrial motions practice. The months between arraignment and trial saw intense legal maneuvering from both the prosecution and defense teams. Sarah Martinez filed a motion to admit Christian's internet search history, arguing that searches for how hard to hit someone to kill them and how to get emancipated from foster parents demonstrated premeditation and motive. The defense countered with a motion to suppress this evidence, claiming the search warrant for Christian's electronic devices had been overly broad and violated his Fourth Amendment rights. Judge Harrington ultimately ruled in favor of the prosecution, finding that the search warrant had been properly obtained based on probable cause and appropriately limited in scope. Miranda Chen filed a motion to allow expert testimony on reactive attachment disorder and its impact on Christian's behavior, essentially laying the groundwork for what legal observers recognized as a diminished capacity defense, not claiming Christian didn't commit the acts, but arguing he lacked the mental capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. The defendant's psychological condition prevented him from engaging in the cool, rational premeditation that first-degree murder requires, Chen argued in her motion. His actions, while violent and tragic, were the result of an emotional breakdown triggered by his attachment disorder, not calculated planning. Prosecutor Martinez vigorously opposed this motion, arguing that allowing such testimony would confuse the jury about the legal standards for first-degree murder. The defendant's internet searches, theft of money, and calculated flight after the murders clearly demonstrate his ability to plan and execute deliberate actions, Martinez countered. Whatever psychological challenges he may have faced, The evidence shows he understood exactly what he was doing before, during, and after killing his foster parents. Judge Harrington ruled that the defense could present expert testimony on Christian's psychological condition, but with limitations. The experts could not offer opinions on whether Christian had the capacity to form specific intent, as this was ultimately a question for the jury to decide. Throughout these pre-trial proceedings, Christian remained in detention at the Baltimore County Detention Center, housed in a special unit for juveniles being tried as adults. His court appearances showed a physical transformation. The baby-faced teenager from his initial arrest had grown taller and leaner, his voice deeper, as adolescence continued its relentless progression despite his incarceration. Detention center staff reported that Christian was a model inmate, following rules meticulously and spending most of his time reading books provided by his defense team on psychology and legal procedure, a detail the prosecution would later use to argue that his compliant behavior was further evidence of his capacity to control his actions when it suited his purposes. Media coverage of the case remained intense, with legal analysts debating the merits of trying juveniles as adults and mental health experts weighing in on attachment disorders in foster children. The Stobner's church community established a memorial scholarship in their name for students pursuing careers in social work or foster care advocacy, turning their tragedy into an opportunity to support the cause they had dedicated their lives to. Meanwhile, a smaller but vocal advocacy group formed around Christian's case, arguing that his situation highlighted the failures of a foster care system that moved children between placements without adequate psychological support or preparation for caregivers dealing with severely traumatized youth. As the September trial date approached, both legal teams engaged in final preparations, interviewing witnesses, refining their strategies, and preparing their respective narratives of what had happened in the Stobner home on that fatal May evening. For the prosecution, the story was one of a calculating, materialistic teenager who killed his generous foster parents because they refused to buy him an expensive car. For the defense, it was the tragic culmination of a lifetime of trauma and institutional failure that had left a damaged child incapable of processing rejection in normal, nonviolent ways. Between these competing narratives lay the complex truth of Christian Stobner and the horrific acts that had transformed him from an ordinary teenager into one of the youngest defendants to face adult murder charges in Baltimore County history. The final pre-trial hearing was held on September 11, 2023, just 1 week before the scheduled start of the trial. Judge Harrington reviewed the witness lists, ruled on remaining evidentiary matters, and confirmed that both sides were prepared to proceed. This case has attracted significant public attention, the judge noted, addressing the packed courtroom. I want to remind everyone that our obligation is to ensure a fair trial based on the evidence, not on media coverage or public opinion. As the hearing concluded, Christian was led back to detention, his face impassive as it had been throughout the proceedings, while both legal teams returned to their offices for the final days of preparation before the dramatic courtroom confrontation that would determine his fate. The Baltimore County Circuit Court's largest courtroom was filled to capacity on the morning of September 18, 2023, as the trial of 15-year-old Christian Stobner officially began. Television cameras positioned in the hallway captured the arrival of key participants, the somber-faced relatives of the Stobners, the determined stride of prosecutor Sarah Martinez and her team, the protective formation of defense attorney Miranda Chen, walking alongside her young client, whose thin frame seemed swallowed by his navy blue suit. Judge Eleanor Harrington had ruled that while cameras would not be permitted inside the courtroom during testimony, they could record the opening and closing statements, a compromise that acknowledged the significant public interest in the case while protecting witnesses from potential intimidation. The jury selection process had been painstaking, with both legal teams carefully vetting potential jurors for biases related to juvenile offenders, foster care, and violent crime. The final panel consisted of 8 women and 4 men, with 2 alternates, a diverse group in terms of age, race, and socioeconomic background, though notably lacking any foster parents or social workers, both sides having used peremptory challenges to exclude individuals with direct professional experience in the child welfare system. Judge Harrington opened proceedings by instructing the jury on their responsibilities and the presumption of innocence, emphasizing that despite Christian's young age, he was to be evaluated according to adult legal standards as a result of the transfer from juvenile court. Prosecutor Sarah Martinez approached the jury box for her opening statement, her expression grave, as she established eye contact with each juror before beginning to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about betrayal in its most fundamental form," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. Christian and Christina Stubner opened their home and their hearts to the defendant, Christian Stubner, providing him with stability, care, and love after years in the foster system. They gave him a comfortable home, supported his education, included him in family activities, and treated him as their son in every meaningful way. Martinez paced slowly before the jury as she continued, her movements deliberate and her timing impeccable as she built her narrative. In return for their generosity and love, the defendant rewarded them with unimaginable violence, stabbing Christina Stubner 7 times as she prepared dinner in their kitchen, then ambushing Christian Stubner Sr. when he came downstairs to investigate, stabbing him in the back before bludgeoning him with a cast-iron skillet with such force that his skull was shattered. She paused, allowing the brutality of the description to register with the jury, several of whom visibly flinched. And why did the defendant commit these horrific acts? Because his foster parents refused to buy him a $65,000 BMW for his 16th birthday, a luxury car that one of his classmates drove to school. The prosecutor outlined the evidence the state would present: the forensic findings linking Christian to the murders, his incriminating internet search history, witness testimony about his obsession with the car, financial records showing he had stolen $3,000 from his foster parents in the weeks before the killings, and his calculated attempt to flee the state afterward. The evidence will show that these murders were not impulsive acts of a troubled child, but the calculated decisions of an individual who valued material possessions over human lives, who decided that if he couldn't have the expensive car he wanted, he would eliminate the people standing in his way. Martinez concluded her opening by addressing the mental health defense she anticipated from the opposing counsel. You will likely hear about the defendant's difficult childhood and psychological challenges, and while these may help you understand how someone could commit such terrible acts, they do not excuse or justify them. The defendant knew exactly what he was doing when he plunged that knife into Christina Stubner's chest, when he struck Christian Stubner Sr. repeatedly with that skillet, and when he packed his bags and attempted to flee to North Carolina with stolen money. The state asks that you follow the evidence, apply the law as Judge Harrington instructs you, and return the only verdict consistent with that evidence: guilty of first-degree murder. Defense attorney Miranda Chen approached the jury next, her demeanor noticeably different from Martinez's commanding presence. Where the prosecutor had projected authority and righteous indignation, Chen conveyed compassion and a plea for understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has just presented you with what appears to be a simple narrative. A teenager killed his foster parents because they wouldn't buy him an expensive car, she began, her voice quieter than Martinez's, forcing the jurors to lean forward slightly to hear her. But human behavior, especially the behavior of a child who has experienced profound trauma, is rarely so simple. Chen walked closer to the jury box, establishing a more intimate connection as she continued. Christian Stobner entered the foster care system at 6 years old when his mother was incarcerated for drug addiction. By the time he was placed with the Stobners at 13, he had lived in 7 different homes and 2 group facilities. Each placement began with hope and ended with rejection. Or at least, that's how it felt to a child whose developing brain was shaped by instability and loss. The defense attorney acknowledged the tragedy of the Stobners' deaths, but reframed the context. What happened on May 7, 2023, was not about a car. The BMW was a symbol to Christian, a symbol of acceptance, of permanence, of finally belonging somewhere. When his foster parents refused to consider it, Christian didn't hear a reasonable financial decision. He heard the same message he'd internalized his entire life. You're not really our child. You don't really belong here. We don't love you enough. Chen introduced the concept of reactive attachment disorder to the jury, explaining how early childhood trauma affects brain development and emotional regulation. You will hear from experts who will explain that children with this condition can appear normal in many situations but experience overwhelming emotional responses to perceived rejection. Their fight-or-flight response is constantly activated, and when triggered, they can experience what psychologists call emotional flooding, a state where rational thought is literally neurologically impossible. She carefully avoided suggesting that Christian didn't commit the acts he was accused of, instead focusing on his diminished capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. The evidence will show that what happened that night was not a calculated execution, but the tragic culmination of a lifetime of trauma, a psychological breakdown triggered by what Christian perceived as the final rejection in a life full of rejections. We are not asking you to excuse his actions or to return a not guilty verdict. We are asking you to understand the context of those actions and to recognize that they do not meet the legal definition of first-degree murder, which requires premeditation and deliberation. Chen concluded by asking the jury to keep an open mind and to consider the distinction between explaining behavior and excusing it. Understanding why this tragedy occurred doesn't diminish its impact on the victims and their loved ones. But justice requires that we apply the correct legal standards to the facts, taking into account the defendant's mental state at the time of the offense. When you do that, we believe you will find Christian guilty of a lesser charge, but not first-degree murder. Judge Harrington called a brief recess after the opening statements, giving the jury time to process the competing narratives before the presentation of evidence began. In the hallway outside the courtroom, reporters analyzed the opening strategies, with legal commentators noting that the case would likely hinge on the jury's reception of the psychological evidence and whether they would accept diminished capacity as a mitigating factor despite the brutality of the crimes. The prosecution has the forensic evidence on their side, remarked one analyst for a national news network. The defense is banking on humanizing Christian and creating reasonable doubt about his state of mind, rather than the acts themselves. When court reconvened, Prosecutor Martinez called her first witness, Dr. Eleanor Patel, the medical examiner who had performed the autopsies on Christian and Christina Stobner. Dr. Patel, a petite woman with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, took the stand with the confidence of someone who had testified in hundreds of homicide trials. After establishing her credentials, board certification in forensic pathology, 22 years of experience, and over 4,000 autopsies performed, Martinez guided her through her findings using diagrams rather than the actual autopsy photos to spare the jury the most graphic images while still conveying the severity of the injuries. Dr. Patel, based on your examination, what was the cause of death for Christina Stobner? Martinez asked. Christina Stobner died from exsanguination, blood loss, resulting from multiple stab wounds, the most significant being a wound that penetrated her heart, Dr. Patel explained, pointing to the corresponding area on an anatomical diagram. She suffered a total of 7 stab wounds to her torso, all consistent with a kitchen knife similar to the one found at the scene. When asked about Christian Sr.'s injuries, Dr. Patel's testimony became even more disturbing. Mr. Stobner suffered 2 stab wounds to his back, which would have been painful and debilitating but not immediately fatal. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, resulting in catastrophic skull fractures and traumatic brain injury. Martinez asked the medical examiner to elaborate on the amount of force required to cause such injuries. The fracture patterns indicate extremely forceful blows, consistent with someone wielding the cast-iron skillet found at the scene with maximum force. The first blow would likely have rendered the victim unconscious, while subsequent blows caused the extensive fragmentation of the skull observed during autopsy. During cross-examination, defense attorney Chen focused on timing and the potential for a state of emotional dissociation. Dr. Patel, would you agree that the nature of these injuries, particularly the multiple stab wounds to Mrs. Stobner and the repeated blows to Mr. Stobner's head, could be consistent with someone in a state of extreme emotional arousal or dissociation? Dr. Patel considered the question carefully before responding. From a purely medical standpoint, the injuries are consistent with someone using extreme force, which could be associated with a state of heightened emotion. However, I cannot speak to the psychological state of the assailant. That would be outside my area of expertise. Chen nodded, accepting the limitation while having planted the seed of her defense theory. Just one more question, Doctor. In your experience, is it uncommon to see overkill, the use of more force or injury than necessary to cause death, in cases involving perpetrators with close relationships to the victims? Dr. Patel adjusted her glasses before answering. In forensic pathology, we do sometimes observe that crimes involving family members or close acquaintances show evidence of what we term overkill, which can reflect the emotional component of the assault rather than a calculated attempt to ensure death. As the medical examiner stepped down, Martinez appeared unfazed by the defense's questioning, confident that the brutal nature of the injuries would overshadow any psychological contextualizing. The prosecution's next witness was Detective James Phillips, who provided a methodical overview of the investigation, from the initial discovery of the bodies to Christian's arrest at the bus station. Using crime scene photographs, he walked the jury through the bloody footprints matching Christian's shoes, the fingerprint on the cast-iron skillet, and the DNA evidence linking the teenager to the murders. In the defendant's backpack, we found clothing stained with blood that matched both victims, approximately $2,200 in cash, and a prepaid debit card activated 3 days before the murders, Phillips testified, his experience as a witness evident in his clear, factual delivery. Martinez directed Phillips to Christian's internet search history, displayed on a large screen visible to the jury. Can you tell the court what the defendant searched for in the weeks leading up to the murders? Phillips referred to his notes as he responded. On April 23rd, he searched BMW M4 price and visited several luxury car websites. On April 29th, he searched how to get emancipated from foster parents and visited several legal websites discussing emancipation requirements. On May 2nd, he searched how to access parent bank account and how to get fake ID. Most concerning, on May 5th, just 2 days before the murders, he searched how hard to hit someone to kill them and fastest way to kill someone. The detective's testimony continued into the late afternoon, with Martinez methodically building her case that Christian had not acted in a moment of emotional breakdown, but had planned the murders in advance, stealing money, researching methods of killing, and preparing an escape plan. As the first day of trial concluded, legal observers noted that the prosecution had established a compelling narrative of premeditation, leaving the defense with the challenging task of convincing the jury that, despite this evidence, Christian lacked the mental capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. The trial was scheduled to continue the following morning, with the prosecution planning to call witnesses who would testify to Christian's behavior and statements in the days leading up to the murders. The second day of trial began with the testimony of Travis Holden, the delivery driver, whose alertness had led to the discovery of the Stobners' bodies. Dressed in his brown uniform and visibly nervous about testifying, Holden described approaching the Stobner home on the afternoon of May 8, 2023, and noticing the blood visible through the window. "I've been delivering to that neighborhood for 9 years, so I knew the Stobners pretty well. Nice people, always polite," he explained, his voice slightly unsteady as he recalled the disturbing discovery. "When I saw that reddish smear on the window and the furniture all knocked over inside, I just had a bad feeling. Then I got closer and could see what looked like blood splattered on the walls, and I knew something terrible had happened." Prosecutor Martinez guided Holden through his actions after making the discovery, calling 911, waiting for police to arrive, providing his initial statement, before asking if he had seen Christian in the days before the murders. "Yes, ma'am," Holden replied, glancing briefly at the defendant, who was studiously avoiding eye contact with witnesses. "I delivered a package there on May 5th, and Christian answered the door. He seemed normal enough, but I remember he asked me if I ever delivered to the wealthy neighborhoods on the other side of town, where the big houses are, said something like, 'That's where I should be living.'" Defense Attorney Chen's cross-examination was brief, focusing on whether Holden had noticed any signs of distress or unusual behavior when he encountered Christian 2 days before the murders. "He didn't seem upset or agitated, if that's what you're asking," Holden conceded. "Just regular teenage stuff, maybe a little arrogant about wanting to live in the fancy neighborhood, but nothing that made me think something was wrong." The prosecution's next witness was Emma Schultz, the classmate who had exchanged text messages with Christian on the evening of the murders. The 16-year-old appeared visibly uncomfortable as she took the stand, avoiding looking at Christian, with whom she had once been friends. Martinez gently established the context of their relationship, classmates who occasionally texted about homework and school events, before introducing the critical messages as evidence. "Emma, could you read the messages you received from the defendant on May 7th, starting with the one time-stamped at 6:14 p.m.? Martinez asked, handing her a printed copy of the text exchange. Emma cleared her throat before reading. "She's being such a bitch about me coming home late last weekend, says I'm grounded until further notice, and can forget about getting a car for my birthday." Martinez asked her to continue with the subsequent messages. "It's so unfair. Trent's parents got him that BMW for his birthday, and they don't have any more money than the Stobners do. They're just cheap." Emma paused before reading the final message, sent at 8:23 p.m. "I'm done letting them control my life. Watch the news tomorrow." "Did you respond to this last message?" Martinez asked. "No, I didn't think it was a big deal," Emma replied, her voice tinged with regret. "Christian was always saying dramatic stuff about his foster parents. I thought he was just venting." Martinez nodded understandingly before asking the critical question. "Based on your friendship with the defendant, what was his attitude toward his foster parents in general?" Emma hesitated, glancing at Christian, who was now looking directly at her with an unreadable expression. "He was always complaining about them, saying they treated him like a charity case instead of a real son. He was really fixated on this BMW that our classmate Trent drove to school. Christian kept saying if the Stobners really loved him like a son, they would get him the same car for his birthday." In response to further questions, Emma confirmed that Christian had never mentioned being physically abused or neglected by the Stobners, His complaints centered entirely on material possessions and what he perceived as their unfair rules and limitations. During cross-examination, defense attorney Chen worked to contextualize Christian's complaints within his psychological framework. "Emma, did Christian ever talk to you about his experiences in foster care before the Stobners?" she asked. "Sometimes," Emma acknowledged. "He told me he'd been in a bunch of different homes and that he was always worried the Stobners would get tired of him and send him away like everyone else did." Chen nodded, building on this opening. "So when he complained about not getting the car he wanted, could it be that he was actually expressing a deeper fear of rejection?" Emma considered this before responding. "I guess that could be part of it. He did say once that all the other kids at school had parents who would do anything for them, but he felt like he was just a responsibility to the Stobners, not someone they really loved." The morning continued with testimony from several of the Stobners' neighbors, each contributing pieces to the puzzle of what had happened on May 7th. Patricia Winters, who lived next door, described hearing an argument around 7:30 p.m. "It started in the kitchen. I could see them through the window since our houses are pretty close together. Christina was at the counter preparing dinner, and Christian came in looking upset. I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but their body language was tense, and then I heard Christian yell something like, 'You never let me have anything I want.'" Michael Hayashi, whose house was across the street, testified about seeing Christian Sr.'s car pull into the driveway around 8 p.m., placing him at home shortly before the estimated time of the murders. About 30 minutes later, I heard a loud crash, like furniture falling over, Hayashi recalled. "I didn't think much of it at the time, assumed someone had knocked something over accidentally. It wasn't until the police came the next day that I realized what I might have heard." Perhaps the most impactful testimony came from Dorothy Klein, an elderly neighbor who had known the Stobners for over a decade. "They were such wonderful people," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Christian Sr. would always clear my driveway when it snowed, and Christina brought me soup whenever I was under the weather. They took in foster children because they truly wanted to make a difference in young lives." When asked about her observations of the younger Christian, Klein's expression hardened slightly. "He seemed polite enough when they were around, but I noticed he never helped with yard work or carrying groceries unless Christina specifically asked him to. Once, when they weren't home, I saw him sitting on the front step, and I asked if he'd help me bring in a package that had been delivered. He just said, 'I don't work for you,' and went inside." It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, cold, like I wasn't worth his time. After lunch, the prosecution called Trent Marshall, the classmate whose BMW had become the object of Christian's obsession. The 17-year-old, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed to confirm his privileged background, testified that Christian had approached him multiple times about the car. "He was always asking how fast it could go, how much it cost, what features it had," Trent explained. "At first I thought he was just interested in cars, but then he started saying stuff like, 'My foster parents are going to get me one exactly like this for my birthday.' When I asked if they had promised him that, he said, 'They will if they know what's good for them.' I remember thinking it was a weird thing to say." Martinez then called the Stobners' financial advisor, Robert Chen, no relation to the defense attorney, who testified about the unauthorized withdrawals from their checking account in the weeks before the murders. Between March 26 and May 5, 2023, there were 12 ATM withdrawals totaling $3,000 that the Stobners did not make, Chen explained, displaying bank statements on the courtroom screen. These withdrawals always occurred between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. on school days, when both Christian and Christina Stobner would have been at work. When I called Christina on May 6 to alert her to the unusual activity, she was shocked and said she would discuss it with her husband that evening. The timing of this call, just one day before the murders, was not lost on the jury, several of whom exchanged glances as they realized the implication. The Stobners had likely confronted Christian about the stolen money on the very evening they were killed. Martinez deliberately left this connection implicit, allowing the jurors to draw their own conclusions rather than stating it directly and risking an objection from the defense. The final witness of the day was Brian Taylor, a sales associate at Baltimore Luxury Motors, who testified that Christian had visited the dealership twice in April 2023. He told me he was turning 16 soon and that his parents were buying him a BMW M4 as a present, Taylor recalled. He spent about an hour looking at the model we had on the floor, sitting in it, asking about financing options. When I asked if his parents had discussed a budget with him, he said, "Money isn't an issue. They can't afford it." On Christian's second visit, Taylor continued, the teenager had brought $2,000 in cash, saying he wanted to put down a deposit to secure the specific vehicle before his birthday. I explained that he would need a parent or guardian to actually purchase the car since he was a minor. He seemed irritated and said his foster parents would be in soon, but they never came. Defense attorney Chen's cross-examination focused on Christian's behavior during these dealership visits. Would you describe the defendant as acting irrationally or aggressively during these interactions, she asked. No, not aggressive, Taylor responded. Unrealistic about the process, maybe, but he was polite and well-spoken. He seemed like any excited kid looking forward to getting his first car, just with expensive taste. This testimony supported the defense's narrative that Christian was capable of controlling his behavior in most situations, a point they would use to bolster their argument that his violent outburst represented an acute psychological breakdown rather than his normal functioning. As the second day of trial concluded, Judge Harrington instructed the jury not to discuss the case among themselves or with others, and to avoid media coverage of the proceedings. The prosecution had effectively established not only Christian's presence at the scene and physical connection to the murders, but also a clear motive: his obsession with the BMW, his theft of money toward purchasing it, his foster parents' imminent discovery of that theft, and his explicit frustration with their refusal to buy him the car he wanted. The defense would begin presenting their case the following day, facing the challenging task of convincing the jury that despite this compelling narrative of premeditation, Christian lacked the capacity to form the specific intent for first-degree murder due to his psychological condition. Outside the courthouse, Sarah Martinez gave a brief statement to the assembled media, expressing confidence in the state's case while remaining respectful of the ongoing proceedings. "The evidence speaks for itself," she stated simply. "We believe the jury will see the truth of what happened to Christian and Christina Stobner and return a just verdict." Miranda Chen declined to comment substantively, stating only that the full context of this tragedy has not yet been presented, and asking the public to withhold judgment until they had heard the complete story. As camera crews packed up their equipment and reporters filed their day's stories, the trial of Christian Stobner had already become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Baltimore's recent history, with national media outlets sending correspondents to cover what many were calling a disturbing example of materialism and entitlement taken to a violent extreme. The third day of trial began with the prosecution calling forensic experts to detail the physical evidence linking Christian to the murders. First to testify was Dr. Aisha Johnson, the crime scene supervisor who had overseen the collection and processing of evidence at the Stobner residence. Using a detailed floor plan displayed on screens visible to both the jury and the gallery, Dr. Johnson methodically walked through these blood spatter patterns, explaining how they told the story of what had occurred on May 7th. The blood evidence in the kitchen indicates that Christina Stobner was first attacked near the island, facing her assailant, with the initial stab wounds causing blood to spray in a distinctive pattern consistent with someone of the defendant's height wielding the knife, Dr. Johnson explained, using a laser pointer to indicate the relevant areas on the diagram. The blood trail then shows that she attempted to move away from her attacker toward the living room before collapsing near the refrigerator. Based on the spatter patterns and the position of the body, we believe she was stabbed several more times after falling to the floor. Dr. Johnson then moved to the evidence regarding Christian Sr.'s murder, explaining that blood smears on the staircase suggested he had come downstairs during or immediately after the attack on his wife. The blood evidence indicates Mr. Stoebner was first stabbed near the bottom of the stairs, likely from behind, as he entered the kitchen area. He then appears to have turned to face his attacker based on blood spatter on the wall, indicating he was standing at this point before being struck with the cast iron skillet. The forensic expert continued, describing how the blood evidence showed that Christian Sr. had fallen after the initial blows, but that the attack had continued. The concentration of blood and brain matter near the baseboard here, she said, pointing to another area of the diagram, is consistent with the victim being struck repeatedly while already on the ground and likely unconscious. Prosecutor Martinez then directed Dr. Johnson to the bloody footprints found at the scene. These prints, which were made in the victim's blood, are consistent with size 11 Nike Air Jordan sneakers, the expert testified. We recovered shoes matching this exact pattern from the defendant's backpack at the time of his arrest, with blood from both victims still present in the tread pattern. DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Christian and Christina Stoebner. During cross-examination, defense attorney Chen focused not on disputing the physical evidence, which was overwhelming, but on the timing and sequence of events. Dr. Johnson, based on the blood evidence, is it possible to determine whether there was a significant pause between the attack on Christina Stoebner and the attack on Christian Stoebner Sr.? The forensic expert considered this before responding. The blood evidence suggests that both attacks occurred in relatively quick succession, with Mr. Stoebner likely coming downstairs very shortly after the attack on Mrs. Stoebner began, based on the overlapping blood patterns. Chen nodded, following up with another timing question. And after both victims were deceased, does the blood evidence indicate that the perpetrator immediately left the scene or remained in the house for some time? Dr. Johnson referred to her notes before answering. The blood tracking patterns suggest movement throughout the first floor after both attacks were completed, including to areas where no direct assaults took place. Additionally, partial bloody fingerprints on drawers and cabinets suggest someone searched through various areas of the house afterward. This testimony supported the prosecution's narrative that Christian had methodically searched for valuables after killing his foster parents, but Chen would later use it to suggest that his post-murder behavior demonstrated dissociation rather than calculated action. Someone in a normal psychological state who had just committed such violent acts would typically flee immediately, wouldn't they? Chen asked. That would be a common reaction, yes, Dr. Johnson acknowledged. However, searching the premises afterward could indicate either calculation or a state of shock and dissociation. The physical evidence cannot distinguish between those psychological states. The next witness was Gabriela Vega, the fingerprint analyst who had processed the cast iron skillet used to kill Christian Sr. Using enlarged photographs, Vega showed the jury how a bloody fingerprint on the handle matched Christian's right index finger. The match is conclusive, with 17 points of comparison, Vega testified. This is well above the standard required for a positive identification in fingerprint analysis. Following the fingerprint evidence, Martinez called Dr. Marcus Thompson, the DNA analyst, who had processed the biological evidence from the scene. We found the defendant's DNA mixed with Christian Stoebner Sr.'s blood on the handle of the cast iron skillet, Dr. Thompson explained. This indicates that the defendant was bleeding at the time he handled the weapon, likely from a cut sustained during the attack. The analyst further testified that traces of both victims' blood were found on the clothing in Christian's backpack, with spatter patterns consistent with someone standing in close proximity during the stabbings and subsequent bludgeoning. The morning's testimony established beyond reasonable doubt that Christian had physically committed the murders, a fact that even the defense had not seriously contested. The afternoon session shifted focus from the physical evidence to Christian's mental state and behavior surrounding the killings, with the prosecution calling Dr. Harold Freeman, the psychiatrist who had evaluated Christian for the state. Dr. Freeman, a distinguished forensic psychiatrist with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, testified that he had conducted 3 evaluation sessions with Christian, totaling approximately 9 hours, and had reviewed his medical records, school history, and prior psychological assessments. While the defendant does have a history of multiple foster placements and associated adjustment difficulties, I did not find evidence of a severe mental disorder that would prevent him from understanding the nature and consequences of his actions or from forming the specific intent required for first-degree murder, Dr. Freeman stated. The psychiatrist acknowledged that Christian showed some traits consistent with reactive attachment disorder, but disputed the defense's characterization of its severity. In my professional opinion, the defendant exhibits calculating behavior, impulse control, and awareness of consequences that are inconsistent with the profound emotional dysregulation the defense suggests, Dr. Freeman testified. His internet searches before the murders, his theft of money over several weeks, and his methodical actions after the killings, packing specific items, taking cash, attempting to establish an alibi through text messages, all indicate an individual capable of planning, executing, and attempting to evade responsibility for premeditated acts. Martinez asked Dr. Freeman to elaborate on Christian's apparent lack of remorse, a topic that had been referenced throughout the trial. During our sessions, the defendant spoke about the deaths of his foster parents in a detached, matter-of-fact manner, focusing primarily on how their rules and limitations had affected him rather than on the loss of their lives, the psychiatrist explained. When I asked directly about how he felt about their deaths, he stated, "They weren't really my parents anyway." This statement suggests a compartmentalization and devaluation of the victims that allowed him to justify violence against them. Defense attorney Chen's cross-examination of Dr. Freeman was perhaps the most contentious exchange of the trial thus far, with Chen challenging the psychiatrist's conclusions and methodology. Dr. Freeman, you've testified that Christian doesn't have a severe mental disorder that would affect his capacity to form intent, but you did diagnose him with reactive attachment disorder, correct? Freeman nodded. Yes, I noted features consistent with that diagnosis, though not as severe as the defense's expert suggests. Chen pressed further. And isn't it true that reactive attachment disorder specifically affects an individual's ability to form appropriate emotional bonds and responses to caregivers? The psychiatrist acknowledged this, but qualified his answer. Yes, but the degree to which it affects behavior varies significantly among individuals with the diagnosis. Many people with attachment disorders never commit violent acts. I'm not suggesting everyone with this disorder commits violence, Dr. Freeman, Chen countered. I'm asking specifically about how this condition affects the emotional processing of perceived rejection from caregivers. Freeman conceded that individuals with attachment disorders often experience rejection more intensely than others, but maintained that this didn't negate the ability to premeditate actions or understand their consequences. Chen then shifted to challenging the limited time Freeman had spent evaluating Christian compared to the defense's expert. You spent a total of 9 hours with my client, correct? Are you aware that Dr. Rivera, our expert, conducted 12 sessions totaling over 20 hours in addition to administering standardized psychological assessments that you did not use? Freeman bristled slightly at the implication that his evaluation was insufficient. Quality of assessment is not simply a function of hours spent, counselor. I conducted a thorough evaluation using standard forensic psychiatric protocols appropriate for determining criminal responsibility. The defense attorney's final line of questioning focused on the developmental aspects of adolescent psychology. Dr. Freeman, would you agree that the adolescent brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and consequence evaluation, is still developing at age 15? The psychiatrist acknowledged this neurological reality, but resisted its application to the case at hand. Yes, adolescent brain development is ongoing until the mid-20s, but this general principle doesn't mean that a specific 15-year-old is incapable of premeditation or understanding the consequences of murder. As Dr. Freeman stepped down, Judge Harrington announced that the court would recess for the day, with the defense scheduled to begin presenting its case the following morning. The prosecution had effectively established not only the physical evidence linking Christian to the murders, but had also presented a compelling expert opinion that he possessed the mental capacity for premeditation despite his psychological challenges. Martinez's closing statement to the jury before the recess was succinct. "The state rests, Your Honor." Outside the courtroom, legal analysts commented on the strength of the prosecution's case, with many suggesting that the defense faced an uphill battle in persuading the jury that Christian's psychological state mitigated his responsibility despite the evidence of planning and calculation. The prosecution has methodically built a case that addresses both the physical evidence and the question of intent, noted one commentator for a legal news network. The defense will need to present extremely compelling psychological testimony to overcome the impression that this was a calculated act, motivated by material desire and rage. As Christian was led back to detention, reporters noticed that his previously impassive demeanor had begun to show cracks, with the teenager occasionally glancing nervously at his attorney during the forensic testimony. Whether this represented growing awareness of his situation or strategic coaching by his defense team remained unclear, but the shift was notable to those who had been observing him throughout the proceedings. The trial was scheduled to continue the following morning, with the defense prepared to present their counter-narrative of a traumatized child pushed beyond his psychological breaking point by perceived rejection from yet another set of caregivers. The fourth day of trial began with the defense presenting its case, calling Dr. Melissa Rivera, a child psychologist specializing in trauma and attachment disorders, as their first expert witness. Dr. Rivera, with her gentle demeanor and clear speaking style, presented a stark contrast to the prosecution's forensic experts from the previous day. Before she began her testimony, Judge Harrington instructed the jury that expert opinions on psychological conditions were being presented to help them understand the defendant's mental state, but that they must ultimately determine whether Christian had the capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. Dr. Rivera, could you explain to the jury your qualifications and the extent of your evaluation of the defendant? Defense Attorney Chen began. The psychologist detailed her 25 years of experience working specifically with foster children and those suffering from attachment disorders, as well as her extensive evaluation of Christian, which had included 12 sessions over 2 months, standardized psychological assessments, and reviews of his complete foster care, history, school records, and previous psychological evaluations. Based on your comprehensive assessment, what is your professional diagnosis of Christian Stobner? Chen asked. Christian meets the clinical criteria for reactive attachment disorder, or RAD, as well as complex post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from childhood neglect and the instability of multiple foster placements, Dr. Rivera explained. These conditions fundamentally alter how a person perceives and responds to relationships, particularly with parental figures or caregivers. Chen asked the psychologist to elaborate on how these conditions develop and their effects on behavior. Reactive attachment disorder develops when a child's basic needs for comfort, affection, and nurturing aren't met, and they don't establish healthy emotional bonds with caregivers, Dr. Rivera explained. In Christian's case, his biological mother's drug addiction led to severe neglect during his crucial early developmental years from infancy to age 6. The brain actually develops differently under these conditions, particularly in areas related to emotional regulation and trust. The psychologist then walked the jury through Christian's foster care history, explaining that while his file contained mostly positive reports, the pattern of multiple placements had reinforced his perception that relationships were temporary and conditional. By the time Christian was placed with the Stobners at age 13, he had internalized a core belief that he was fundamentally unlovable, and that all relationships would eventually end in rejection, Dr. Rivera testified. This created a psychological defense mechanism where he avoided genuine emotional attachment while simultaneously craving it desperately, a common paradox in children with RAD. Chen directed the testimony toward the specific incident that led to the murders. Dr. Rivera, in your professional opinion, how would someone with Christian's psychological condition perceive his foster parents' refusal to buy him the BMW he wanted? The psychologist leaned forward slightly, clearly wanting the jury to understand this crucial point. For most teenagers, being told no about an expensive purchase would be disappointing but manageable. For Christian, with his attachment disorder and complex trauma, this refusal wasn't processed as a reasonable parental boundary, but as confirming his deepest fear, that he wasn't truly valued or loved by the Stobners. Dr. Rivera continued, explaining the concept of emotional flooding that can occur in individuals with attachment disorders. When someone with RAD perceives rejection from a caregiver, it can trigger what we call emotional flooding, a neurological state where the person is overwhelmed by intense emotions that bypass rational thought. The prefrontal cortex, which controls impulse regulation and consequence evaluation, is effectively offline during these episodes, while the amygdala, the brain's fear center, takes over. The psychologist emphasized that this wasn't an excuse for violent behavior, but a neurological reality that affected Christian's capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. In my professional opinion, Christian was in a state of emotional flooding when he killed the Stobners, a dissociative state where he was not capable of the cool, rational premeditation that first-degree murder requires. Prosecutor Martinez's cross-examination was methodical and skeptical, challenging the foundations of Rivera's conclusions. Dr. Rivera, you've testified that Christian was in a state of emotional flooding during the murders, but you weren't present during the incident, were you? The psychologist acknowledged she wasn't. I'm basing my opinion on my evaluation of Christian, his recollection of the events, and my knowledge of how attachment disorders affect behavior during perceived rejection. Martinez pressed harder. So your conclusion about his mental state during the murders is based primarily on what the defendant told you happened? Rivera shook her head. It's based on his account in combination with the physical evidence, the established patterns of behavior in individuals with his specific diagnosis, and neuropsychological testing that confirmed his attachment disorder and trauma response patterns. The prosecutor then addressed the apparent premeditation evident in Christian's behavior. Dr. Rivera, how do you reconcile your theory of impulsive emotional flooding with the defendant's internet searches about killing methods days before the murders, his systematic theft of money over several weeks, and his preparatory actions like activating a prepaid debit card? Rivera acknowledged these were important points, but maintained they didn't contradict her diagnosis. Individuals with attachment disorders often fantasize about or research scenarios involving control or revenge when they feel powerless in relationships. These searches could represent emotional coping mechanisms rather than actual planning. As for the money, Christian likely saw this as insurance against rejection, a way to provide for himself if the placement failed, as all his previous ones had. Martinez's final question was perhaps her most effective. Dr. Rivera, if Christian was in this dissociative state you described during the murders, incapable of rational thought or premeditation, how do you explain his presence of mind immediately afterward to change his clothes, pack specific items including the stolen money, and attempt to leave the state? The psychologist hesitated briefly before responding. After extreme emotional flooding, there's often a period of emotional numbness and attached automatic behavior. Christian's actions after the murders are consistent with someone in a dissociative state following trauma, moving through procedures without fully processing what had occurred. Following Dr. Rivera's testimony, the defense called Brian Matthews, Christian's social worker, for the 2 years before he was placed with the Stobners. Matthews, a soft-spoken man in his early 40s, provided context about Christian's background in the foster system. Christian came to me after his 7th placement failed, Matthews explained. Each transition was traumatic for him, reinforcing his belief that he was unwanted. By the time he was placed with the Stobners, he had developed a protective shell, appearing compliant on the surface, while remaining emotionally detached to protect himself from the pain of inevitable rejection. Chen asked about Matthews's observations of Christian's relationship with the Stobners. Initially, it seemed promising, the social worker recalled. The Stobners were experienced foster parents with a good track record. Christian appeared to be adjusting well during my home visits, but I noticed he rarely made eye contact with them or initiated physical affection, common signs of attachment issues. In our private sessions, he would say things like, "They're nice enough, but it's just temporary. It always is." Matthews also testified about conversations he'd had with the Stobners regarding Christian's materialistic focus. Christina called me about 2 months before the incident, concerned that Christian seemed increasingly focused on expensive possessions, he stated. She mentioned he was obsessed with a classmate's luxury car and kept insisting they could afford to buy him one for his birthday. I advised them to maintain consistent boundaries while reassuring Christian of their commitment to him regardless of material gifts. The social worker's testimony supported the defense's narrative that Christian's fixation on the BMW wasn't simply teenage materialism, but a symbolic test of the Stobners' love and commitment, a test that, in Christian's damaged perception, they had failed by refusing the car, triggering his psychological breakdown. During cross-examination, Martinez focused on whether Matthews had ever observed violent tendencies or warned the Stobners about potential danger. No, Matthews admitted, Christian had no history of violence in his file. His previous placement failures were due to his emotional withdrawal and difficulty connecting, not aggression. The defense's next witness was Janet Wilson, Christian's 5th-grade teacher, who had maintained contact with him over the years. Wilson testified about Christian's academic abilities and the behavioral changes she observed during his time in her classroom. He was one of my brightest students, particularly gifted in mathematics and science, Wilson recalled. But emotionally he was always on edge, as if waiting for something bad to happen. When I would praise his work, he'd often say things like, "It doesn't matter," or "Nobody cares anyway." Statements that worried me enough to refer him for counseling, Wilson described maintaining contact with Christian after he moved on to middle school, occasionally meeting him for ice cream or attending his school events when invited. He seemed to trust me because I had never abandoned him, as he put it, she explained, her voice catching slightly. After he was placed with the Stobners, we met for ice cream about a month before the incident. He mentioned they had refused to buy him a car for his birthday, and I suggested that maybe it was too expensive or not practical for a new driver. His response haunts me now. He said, if they really wanted me to stay, they'd get it for me. When I asked what he meant, he just shrugged and changed the subject. This testimony introduced a critical element of the defense's case. that Christian had equated the car with his permanence in the Stobner home, viewing their refusal as confirmation that they, like all his previous caregivers, would eventually send him away. In Christian's distorted perception, shaped by attachment disorder and childhood trauma, the car wasn't just a status symbol, but a measure of whether he was truly accepted as their son. The day's final witness was Dr. Lawrence Kim, a neuropsychiatrist specializing in adolescent brain development, who testified about how trauma affects the developing brain and how Christian's specific neurological patterns differed from those of a typical 15-year-old. Using brain scan images displayed on screens visible to the jury, Dr. Kim pointed out abnormalities in Christian's amygdala and prefrontal cortex, areas responsible for emotional regulation and impulse control. These scans show hyperactivity in the amygdala, consistent with someone in a constant state of vigilance against perceived threats, Dr. Kim explained. Simultaneously, we see reduced connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, which would normally allow rational thought to moderate emotional responses. This pattern is consistent with early childhood trauma and makes it neurologically more difficult for Christian to control impulses when emotionally triggered. During cross-examination, Martinez challenged the relevance of these general brain patterns to the specific actions taken by Christian on the night of the murders. Doctor, these scans were taken months after the murders, correct? You can't tell us what was happening in the defendant's brain at the exact moment he stabbed Christina Stobner 7 times or continued to beat Christian Stobner Sr. after he was already unconscious, can you? Dr. Kim acknowledged this limitation, but maintained that the patterns observed were chronic, not acute, suggesting Christian's neurological function would have been similarly impaired during periods of extreme emotional distress. As the 4th day of trial concluded, legal observers noted that the defense had presented a coherent alternative narrative for the jury to consider, not denying Christian's actions, but contextualizing them within his psychological trauma and neurological impairments. However, many questioned whether this would be sufficient to overcome the prosecution's compelling evidence of planning and calculation before and after the murders. The question before the jury was increasingly focused not on whether Christian had killed his foster parents, but on his state of mind when doing so, a question that would determine whether he would be convicted of first-degree murder with its potential life sentence or a lesser charge that might offer the possibility of eventual release. Outside the courtroom, a small group of advocates for foster youth held a vigil, not excusing Christian's actions, but calling attention to the systemic failures they believed had contributed to the tragedy. This case highlights the critical need for trauma-informed care and comprehensive psychological support for children in foster care, said one advocate to assembled reporters. While nothing justifies violence, we must recognize that children with attachment disorders require specialized interventions to heal and form healthy relationships. The trial was scheduled to continue the following day, with additional defense witnesses and, potentially, testimony from Christian himself, a high-risk strategy that his defense team was reportedly still deliberating as the 4th day of proceedings concluded. The 5th day of trial began with a palpable tension in the courtroom as spectators and legal observers anticipated the defense's most critical decision, whether Christian Stobner would take the stand in his own defense. This question was answered when defense attorney Miranda Chen approached Judge Harrington's bench at the start of proceedings and informed the court that after careful consideration and extensive consultation with her client, Christian would indeed testify. This announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the gallery, as legal experts had been divided on whether the potential benefits of humanizing Christian to the jury would outweigh the risks of cross-examination by the skilled prosecutor Sarah Martinez. Before Christian testified, the defense called one final expert witness, Dr. Evelyn Santos, a specialist in adolescent psychology who had reviewed the case materials but had not personally evaluated Christian. Dr. Santos provided broader context about developmental factors affecting teenage decision-making, particularly under stress. Adolescents generally have a neurobiological predisposition toward impulsivity and emotion-driven behavior, she explained. Their brains are simply not equipped to process emotional situations with the same rational capacity as adults, particularly in high-stress scenarios. Chen directed Dr. Santos to address how this developmental reality intersected with Christian's specific psychological conditions. When you layer reactive attachment disorder and complex trauma on top of the normal adolescent brain, you have a neurological perfect storm, the psychologist testified. The typical teenage limitations in judgment and impulse control are magnified exponentially in someone with Christian's background of disrupted attachments and perceived rejections. After this contextual testimony, which faced only brief cross-examination from Martinez, the moment arrived for Christian to take the stand. The courtroom fell silent as the 15-year-old was escorted to the witness box, his handcuffs removed, before he entered the jury's line of sight. Dressed in a light blue button-down shirt and khaki pants that emphasized his youth, Christian appeared noticeably more anxious than he had during previous court appearances, his eyes darting between his attorney, the jury, and occasionally toward the gallery where a small group of his former group home staff sat in support. After being sworn in, Christian sat with his hands folded in his lap, his shoulders hunched slightly, as if trying to make himself smaller. Defense attorney Chen began with gentle questions about his early childhood, allowing him to explain in his own words his first memories of his biological mother's drug use, the neglect he had experienced, and his entry into the foster care system at age 6. "I remember being hungry a lot," Christian said, his voice quiet but steadier than might have been expected. "Sometimes Mom would forget to come home for days, and I'd eat whatever I could find in the cabinets. When the neighbors called CPS, I didn't want to go with them, even though I was scared at home. At least I knew what to expect there." Chen guided Christian through the chronology of his foster placements, asking him to describe how it felt to be moved from home to home. "The first couple of times I cried a lot," he admitted. "I kept thinking if I was good enough, they'd let me stay. But after the 4th or 5th move, I stopped unpacking my bag completely. What was the point? I figured it was just a matter of time before they sent me away, too." As he spoke about these experiences, Christian's affect remained relatively flat, displaying the emotional detachment that Dr. Rivera had described as characteristic of his attachment disorder. When Chen directed the testimony toward his placement with the Stobners, Christian's demeanor shifted subtly, a flicker of emotion crossing his face before being quickly suppressed. "They seemed nice at first," he said. "They had a nice house, and they said they wanted to adopt someday if things worked out. But that's what they all say in the beginning." He described his early months with the Stobners as okay, noting that they included him in family activities and seemed interested in his schoolwork, but explained that he had remained emotionally guarded. "I didn't want to get too comfortable. Every time I started feeling like maybe a place could be permanent, that's when they'd decide they couldn't handle me anymore." Chen carefully approached the subject of the BMW, asking Christian to explain why the car had become so important to him. His response provided a window into the distorted thinking that had preceded the murders. Trent Marshall's parents got him that car for his birthday, and everyone at school knew they really loved him, Christian explained, leaning forward slightly as his voice gained intensity. "I figured if the Stobners got me the same car, it would mean they saw me as their real son, not just a foster kid they were getting paid to keep. When they said no, it was like confirmation of what I already knew. I wasn't really part of their family, just a temporary responsibility." The defense attorney then asked about the events leading up to May 7, 2023. Christian described increasing tension in the home after he was caught coming home past curfew the weekend before, resulting in being grounded. Christina told me I could forget about getting any car for my birthday, not just the BMW, he recalled. I felt like they were looking for excuses to show me I wasn't really their kid. Real parents forgive their kids when they mess up. They don't hold it over their heads. When Chen finally asked Christian to describe what happened on the evening of the murders, the courtroom grew impossibly still, jurors leaning forward in their seats as the defendant took a deep breath before speaking. "I was in the kitchen when Christina got home," he began, his voice noticeably flatter, as if emotionally disconnecting from the memory. "She was making dinner, and I tried to talk to her about the car again, telling her how important it was to me. She got frustrated and said they'd already decided, no car until I showed more responsibility. Then she mentioned that the bank had called about money missing from their account." Christian's eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance as he continued. "Everything got really hot and loud in my head, like a roaring sound. I felt like I couldn't breathe. She kept talking, saying they knew I'd taken the money and how disappointed they were, but her voice sounded far away, like I was underwater. I saw the knife on the counter, and then it was just happening." He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't remember deciding to pick it up. It was like watching someone else use my hands." Chen gently prompted him to continue, asking about Christian Sr.'s arrival. "I heard him coming down the stairs," Christian said, his voice now almost mechanical. "Christina was on the floor and there was blood everywhere. He came into the kitchen and saw her, and he looked at me with this expression, not even anger, just horror. He started to back up, reaching for his phone, and I couldn't let him call anyone. I grabbed the knife again and went after him. He tried to fight me off, but I was behind him, and then he fell near the stairs. I saw the skillet on the coffee table where someone had left it, and I picked it up. After that, it's mostly a blur until I was standing there, and everything was quiet." When asked about his actions after the murders, Christian described feeling numb and like I was moving through a dream. He explained that he had changed his clothes and packed a bag automatically without really thinking about what I was doing. When Chen asked why he had tried to leave the state, his answer was simple and devastating. "Because I knew no one would want me after what I'd done. No one would ever take me in again." The most critical moment of Christian's testimony came when Chen asked him about a statement he had reportedly made during his initial detention. "You told Detective Phillips they weren't my parents. Can you explain what you meant by that?" Christian looked directly at the jury for the first time since taking the stand. "They weren't my biological parents," he said quietly, "but they were the closest thing to real parents I ever had. I didn't realize that until it was too late." This statement, which seemed to convey a degree of remorse previously absent from Christian's public demeanor, visibly affected several jurors, with one older woman briefly closing her eyes and another juror quickly wiping away a tear. The subtle shift in the courtroom atmosphere was not lost on Prosecutor Martinez, who watched the defendant with narrowed eyes, clearly recalibrating her cross-examination strategy in response to this unexpected display of emotional vulnerability. When Chen concluded her direct examination, Judge Harrington called a 15-minute recess before cross-examination, giving Martinez time to adjust her approach and allowing the jurors a brief respite from the emotionally charged testimony. During the break, legal observers in the hallway noted that Christian's testimony had been more effective than many had anticipated, humanizing him to the jury while supporting the defense's narrative of diminished capacity due to psychological trauma and emotional flooding. When court reconvened, Martinez approached the witness stand with measured steps, her demeanor neither overly aggressive nor sympathetic, a professional prosecutor doing her job. "Christian, you've testified that you experienced what your psychologists call emotional flooding when Christina Stobner confronted you about the stolen money, correct?" Christian nodded before verbally confirming, "Yes, ma'am." Martinez established that this was not the first time the Stobners had set boundaries or refused Christian's requests. They had previously told you no about staying out late, about certain video games you wanted, about other purchases, correct? Christian acknowledged this was true. But you didn't experience this flooding and kill them those times, did you? The question was direct, but delivered without sarcasm or cruelty, simply establishing a fact. The prosecutor then methodically walked through Christian's internet search history, asking him to explain searches for how hard to hit someone to kill them and fastest way to kill someone, conducted days before the murders. I was angry and thinking about hurting them, but I didn't really plan to do it, Christian insisted, his composure beginning to crack under the precision of Martinez's questioning. I look up lots of things I don't actually do. Martinez displayed on the courtroom screen a timeline of Christian's activities in the weeks leading up to the murders. The systematic withdrawal of money from the Stobners' account, his visits to the BMW dealership, his purchase of a prepaid debit card 3 days before the killings, and his text message to Emma Schultz stating, "Watch the news tomorrow," sent hours before the murders. This doesn't look like impulsive behavior triggered by an unexpected confrontation, Martinez observed. This looks like someone methodically preparing for actions they've been contemplating for some time. How do you explain that? Christian struggled to reconcile these documented behaviors with his claim of impulsive, dissociative action. I was preparing in case they kicked me out, he offered weakly. The card and money were so I'd have something if they sent me away. The text to Emma was just me being dramatic. The most damaging moment of cross-examination came when Martinez asked about Christian's statement to Brian Taylor, the car salesman, that his foster parents would be coming in soon to complete the BMW purchase. You told Mr. Taylor your foster parents would be visiting the dealership, but according to your own testimony, they had already clearly told you they wouldn't be buying the car. Were you lying to Mr. Taylor? The question forced Christian to either admit to calculated deception or contradict his earlier testimony about the Stobners' refusal. I was hoping they'd change their minds, Christian mumbled, but the damage was done. The contradiction highlighted exactly what the prosecution had been arguing, that regardless of his psychological challenges, Christian was capable of deliberate planning and manipulation when it suited his purposes. Martinez's final questions returned to the murders themselves, pressing Christian on the excessive violence used against both victims. Christina Stobner was stabbed 7 times, including after she had fallen to the floor. Christian Stobner Sr. was struck with a skillet at least 6 times, most of those after he was already unconscious. If this was just an impulsive response to feeling rejected, why continue the attacks well beyond what was necessary to incapacitate them? Christian had no clear answer, eventually responding, "I don't remember making those decisions. It just happened." When Martinez concluded her cross-examination, Chen had a brief redirect, attempting to recontextualize the evidence within the framework of Christian's psychological condition. Christian, when you searched for information about harming someone, were you actually planning the murders, or were you engaging in what Dr. Rivera called fantasy as emotional coping? Christian seemed to grasp, at this lifeline. I wasn't planning anything real. It was just thoughts when I was angry or scared. As Christian stepped down from the witness stand, returning to the defense table with his shoulders slumped, legal observers had mixed assessments of his testimony's impact. While he had initially created some sympathy among jurors by describing his childhood trauma and expressing a degree of remorse, Martinez's methodical cross-examination had highlighted the inconsistencies between his claimed impulsive action and the evidence of preparation and calculation. The question remained whether the jury would find his psychological explanation sufficient to mitigate his responsibility from first-degree to second-degree murder or manslaughter. The defense formally rested its case following Christian's testimony, and Judge Harrington announced that closing arguments would begin the following morning. As the courtroom emptied, reporters noted that several jurors were watching Christian with expressions ranging from sympathy to skepticism as he was led away by deputies. The teenager's fate now rested on whether those 12 individuals believed that his traumatic background and psychological condition had truly rendered him incapable of the premeditation required for first-degree murder, or whether they would conclude that, despite these challenges, he had made a deliberate decision to kill his foster parents when they refused to give him what he wanted. The final day of Christian Stubner's trial dawned with a media presence outside the Baltimore County Circuit Court that had swelled to unprecedented numbers as national news networks positioned reporters to cover the closing arguments and verdict in a case that had captivated public attention. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity, with court officers turning away latecomers once every seat was taken. Judge Eleanor Harrington opened proceedings by instructing the jury on the law they would apply to the evidence, carefully explaining the differences between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and voluntary manslaughter, as well as the legal standards for diminished capacity and the state's burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. First-degree murder requires the state to prove that the defendant killed the victim with premeditation and deliberation, essentially that he thought about the killing beforehand and made a conscious decision to do it, Judge Harrington explained. Second-degree murder does not require premeditation, but does require an intent to kill or cause serious bodily harm. Voluntary manslaughter involves an intentional killing where the defendant acted in a state of passion or emotional disturbance that would cause a reasonable person to act without self-control. The judge emphasized that the burden remained on the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Christian had the mental capacity to form the specific intent required for whichever charge the jury believed the evidence supported. Prosecutor Sarah Martinez rose for her closing argument, approaching the jury with a deliberate pace that conveyed both confidence and respect for the gravity of their decision. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 5 days, you have heard extensive testimony about what happened in the Stobner home on the evening of May 7th, 2023, she began. You've heard from forensic experts who detailed the physical evidence linking the defendant to these brutal murders. You've heard from friends, neighbors, and acquaintances who described the defendant's obsession with the BMW and his increasing resentment toward his foster parents. You've heard from psychologists with different interpretations of the defendant's mental state, and you've heard from Christian Stubner himself. Martinez paused, letting her opening sink in before continuing. This case, at its core, is about choices and consequences. The evidence has shown beyond any reasonable doubt that Christian Stubner made a series of choices that culminated in the deaths of 2 people who had opened their home to him and treated him as their son. Using a large display board visible to both the jury and the gallery, Martinez outlined a timeline of Christian's actions in the weeks leading up to the murders. His internet searches about killing methods, his systematic theft of money from the Stobner's account, his visits to the BMW dealership, his purchase of a prepaid debit card, and finally, his text message to Emma Schultz hours before the killing stating, "Watch the news tomorrow." These are not the actions of someone who snapped in a moment of emotional flooding, Martinez argued, her voice firm but not harsh. These are the calculated steps of someone building toward violence, someone who decided that if he couldn't have what he wanted, he would eliminate the people standing in his way. The prosecutor acknowledged Christian's difficult childhood and psychological challenges, but insisted they did not negate his ability to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. Many children experience trauma and disrupted attachments without resorting to violence. Many teenagers are told they can't have expensive things they want without stabbing their parents. Martinez then shifted to address the defense's diminished capacity argument directly. The defense asks you to believe that Christian's psychological condition rendered him incapable of premeditation, that he acted in a dissociative state triggered by perceived rejection. But consider his own testimony. He admitted remembering specific details about the murders, the knife on the counter, hearing Christian Sr. coming downstairs, making a conscious decision to prevent him from calling for help, grabbing the skillet from the coffee table. These are not the memories of someone disconnected from reality during a dissociative episode. The prosecutor concluded by reminding the jury of the lives that had been lost and the measured justice the state was seeking. Christina and Christian Stobner Sr. dedicated their lives to helping children in need. They provided a stable, loving home to numerous foster children over the years, including the defendant. They did not deserve to die in their own kitchen, victims of the very child they had committed to nurturing. Martinez's voice softened slightly as she delivered her final lines. The Stobners cannot speak for themselves today. They cannot tell you about their hopes, their dreams, their love for each other, and for the children they cared for. You are their voice now, and the state asks you to speak clearly through your verdict. Christian Stobner is guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. As Martinez returned to her seat, defense attorney Miranda Chen approached the jury, her demeanor more subdued than the prosecutor's, reflecting the more challenging position from which she was arguing. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a tragedy with no winners," Chen began. 2 lives were lost, and another life, that of a 15-year-old boy with a lifetime of trauma behind him, hangs in the balance. The question before you is not whether Christian killed his foster parents. He did, and we have never disputed that fact. The question is whether he did so with the cool, rational premeditation that first-degree murder requires, or whether his actions were the result of a psychological breakdown that prevented him from forming that specific intent. Chen reminded the jury of the extensive testimony they had heard about reactive attachment disorder, complex trauma, and the neurological impact of childhood neglect on brain development. Christian Stobner entered foster care at age 6 after years of severe neglect by his biological mother. By the time he was placed with the Stobners at 13, he had lived in 7 different homes and 2 group facilities. Each transition reinforced his core belief that he was fundamentally unlovable, that all relationships were conditional and temporary. Using brain scan images presented during Dr. Kim's testimony, Chen illustrated the physical differences between Christian's brain and that of a typical 15-year-old, emphasizing the reduced connectivity between his amygdala and prefrontal cortex that impaired his ability to regulate emotional responses. The prosecution points to Christian's internet searches and his theft of money as evidence of premeditation, but these behaviors are equally consistent with the coping mechanisms common in children with attachment disorders, Chen argued. Fantasizing about harming those perceived as rejecting is a documented psychological response in such cases, not a genuine plan of action. The money was insurance against what Christian believed was inevitable rejection, a way to provide for himself when the placement failed, as all his previous ones had. Chen addressed the central symbol in the case, the BMW, reframing it as more than just a material object. To Christian, this car represented acceptance and permanence. In his psychologically damaged perception, if the Stobners would make this significant investment in him, it would prove they saw him as their real son, not just a temporary ward. When they refused, he didn't hear a reasonable financial decision. He heard confirmation of his deepest fear. You don't really belong here. You're not really our child. The defense attorney acknowledged the brutality of the killings, but contextualized it within Christian's psychological condition. The very violence of these acts, the multiple stab wounds, the excessive force used with the skillet, speaks not to calculated murder, but to an emotional breakdown, a neurological storm in which rational thought was literally impossible. Chen reminded the jury that Christian was not an adult, but a 15-year-old with a brain still developing normally, further compromised by the neurological impacts of early trauma. Science has established that adolescents generally have reduced capacity for impulse control and consequence evaluation compared to adults. Layer Christian-specific psychological conditions on top of that, and you have someone neurologically incapable of the cool premeditation first-degree murder requires. Chen concluded by asking the jury not to excuse Christian's actions, but to view them through the appropriate legal and psychological lens. Justice does not demand that we ignore context or complexity. It demands that we apply the law correctly, matching the verdict to the crime actually committed. Christian Stobner killed his foster parents in a state of psychological breakdown that prevented him from forming the specific intent required for first-degree murder. The appropriate verdict is guilty of second-degree murder, acknowledging his responsibility while recognizing the diminished capacity that affected his actions. Following the closing arguments, Judge Harrington provided final instructions to the jury before they began deliberations. The 12 jurors filed out of the courtroom at 11:43 a.m., their faces solemn with the weight of the decision before them. In the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, Christian sat at the defense table with his head slightly bowed, occasionally glancing at his attorney, but otherwise appearing withdrawn, perhaps finally comprehending the full gravity of his situation as his fate passed into the hands of the jury. The wait for a verdict was shorter than many legal observers had predicted. At 4:17 p.m., after just over 4.5 hours of deliberation, the jury notified the court they had reached a decision. As word spread, reporters rushed back to the courtroom, and the gallery quickly filled with spectators, including family members of the Stobners who had attended throughout the trial, and the small contingent of Christian supporters from his previous group home. Christian was brought back into the courtroom, his face pale and his movements stiff with tension. Judge Harrington instructed everyone to remain silent regardless of the verdict, warning that emotional outbursts would result in immediate removal from the courtroom. The jury filed in, none making eye contact with the defendant, their expressions unreadable as they took their seats. The court clerk asked if they had reached a verdict, and the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair, stood and confirmed they had. On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Christina Stobner, how do you find? The clerk asked. The foreperson's voice was clear and unwavering. We find the defendant, Christian Stobner, guilty. A barely audible collective intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Christian Stobner Sr., how do you find? Again the response. We find the defendant, Christian Stobner, guilty. On the additional counts of theft and attempted flight to avoid prosecution, the jury also returned guilty verdicts. Christian's shoulders slumped visibly at the announcement, but his face remained largely impassive, the emotional detachment that had characterized much of his behavior throughout the trial, reasserting itself in this most critical moment. Judge Harrington thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for October 12, 2023, ordering that Christian remain in detention until that time. As the teenager was led from the courtroom by deputies, he glanced back once at the gallery, his expression finally cracking to reveal a flash of what might have been fear or regret, before the doors closed behind him. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Sarah Martinez addressed the assembled media, expressing satisfaction with the verdict while acknowledging the tragedy of the case. Justice was served today for Christina and Christian Stobner. But there are no winners in a case like this, she stated. 2 lives were lost, and a young man will face the consequences of choices he made at 15. We hope this verdict brings some measure of peace to the Stobners' family and friends." Defense attorney Miranda Chen also spoke briefly, indicating that while she respected the jury's decision, she believed there were grounds for appeal based on several evidentiary rulings and the question of whether Christian should have been tried as an adult. This case highlights critical issues in how our system handles juveniles with severe psychological trauma, Chen noted. Christian's actions were horrific, but they occurred in the context of a lifetime of institutional failures that left his profound psychological needs unaddressed. On October 12, 2023, Christian Stobner returned to Judge Harrington's courtroom for sentencing, now 16 years old after celebrating a birthday in detention, a milestone that would have normally been marked by the car he had so desperately wanted. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements from the Stobners' family members, including Christina's sister, who spoke through tears about her siblings' dedication to helping children in need, and her heartbreak that the very work Christina loved had led to her death. Christian Sr.'s brother described the couple's dreams of eventually adopting children and building a large, loving family, dreams cut short by violence in their own home. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Christian stood slowly, his voice barely audible at first as he began to speak. "I don't expect anyone to forgive me," he said, his eyes fixed on the podium rather than meeting the gaze of the Stobners' family members. "I didn't understand what they were trying to do for me until it was too late. They weren't just my foster parents. They were the only real parents I ever had, and I destroyed that." For the first time since his arrest, Christian's voice broke with emotion, a tear sliding down his cheek as he concluded, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I am sorry." Judge Harrington then delivered her sentencing decision, noting that she had considered both the brutality of the crimes and Christian's age and psychological condition. "The law requires that I balance justice for the victims with consideration of factors that may mitigate, though not excuse, the defendant's culpability," she stated. "While I acknowledge the significant trauma and psychological challenges in the defendant's background, the premeditated nature of these killings and their extreme violence demand substantial consequences." The judge sentenced Christian to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years, a sentence that recognized both the severity of the crimes and Christian's youth and potential for rehabilitation. "Mr. Stobner, you will be 41 years old when you first become eligible for parole," Judge Harrington noted. "That gives you many years to reflect on your actions and perhaps develop the emotional understanding and empathy that your psychological condition has made difficult for you. I hope you use that time wisely." As Christian was led from the courtroom for the final time, the case that had captivated public attention for months came to its legal conclusion, though its reverberations would continue through appeals, policy discussions about juvenile justice reform, and debates about the foster care system's approach to children with severe attachment disorders. In the quiet neighborhood where the Stobners had once lived, their home stood empty, a silent reminder of lives cut short and the complex, tragic intersection of childhood trauma, mental health, material desire, and violence that had played out within its walls. The neighbors who had known them established a memorial scholarship in their name at the local high school, ensuring that their commitment to helping children would continue even after their deaths. A legacy of generosity that stood in stark contrast to the brutal manner of their final moments. In the juvenile section of the Maryland Correctional Institution, Christian Stobner began serving his sentence, his case becoming a reference point in legal and psychological literature about juvenile killers, attachment disorders, and the challenges of determining appropriate consequences for terrible acts committed by deeply damaged children. His words in court, "They weren't my parents," would be remembered not as the cold dismissal they had initially seemed, but as the tragic reflection of a life defined by disrupted attachments and the devastating consequences when the psychological wounds of childhood manifest in violence that cannot be undone.